I struggled with depression and anxiety for as long as I can remember. Most people know me as the one that's always making jokes and being goofy and silly and trying to make everybody in the room laugh. But me on the outside is very much a polar opposite of what's been on the inside most of my life. It was like sitting in the middle of a hurricane most of the time. A lot of that was not knowing who I was. I've spent most of my life trying to be accepted. Throughout elementary school and junior high and high school, I was bullied for being different. I felt worthless, inadequate, couldn't measure up. I tried really hard to fill that hollow, empty, broken portion with anything that seemed nice at the time. A lot of self-medicating. I remember going to counselors as a kid and trying to talk about my feelings and how I felt. And at the age of 10, you really don't know how to express that, so you just sit there and cry and wonder what's wrong with you, why you're even here. We kept looking for a church that felt like home. One day we finally found one and we went, and it was probably one of the biggest churches I'd ever been to, which I liked because I liked blending with the crowd. I didn't want to be noticed. I remember us walking in and everybody was really nice. They had door greeters that would shake your hands and say they're so happy to see you and glad you came, even though they didn't know you. I remember walking into this massive sanctuary and then just a sea of people. We took our seats. Remember the message. He was preaching from Ephesians 2:10, and he said, "Your God's a masterpiece." I didn't feel like a masterpiece. He preached about how God had a plan and purpose for us and how he loved us individually, and it was a deep love, an unconditional love, and I wanted that. And then at the end of service, he said for everyone to close their eyes and bow their heads. And if you haven't accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, to lift your hand and repeat this prayer, and I did, because I wanted to be a masterpiece. I wanted to be loved unconditionally. So I grew up in church after that. Every waking moment that wasn't school or sports or anything else, we were at church. I wanted to be at church because I was away from everything else. Years went by and I got more and more involved with church, all the church stuff. I still didn't feel worthy because I would sit in church and hear about this great love, and I would look at some of the other things I did with my life and think that I didn't even deserve that kind of love, that unconditional love that made so much sense as a 12-year-old, lost its luster over the years, and it just got dark. Through that time, I felt a call to ministry, to be a pastor, and to tell people about Jesus and about his unconditional love and his desire to love them and be loved by them. I felt this, but I didn't believe this, so I ran from God. I ended up joining the military because I wanted to do something good with my life that my family could be proud of. Church was probably the last thing on my mind at the time. More and more, I started to read my Bible less and less, and I stopped praying. I remember one day, one of the buddies came up to me and asked me if I wanted to go with him to the bar. And I said, sure. I would DD. Over time, the bar became a second home. And a few drinks became really, really large bar tabs. And my friends carried me to the car. Nobody can outdrink Chuck. Nobody can keep up with Chuck. And I felt cool, I guess, for the first time. But really I was just becoming more and more depressed, and I was just numb. And at 22 years old, I tried to take my own life. After a while, my parents started to talk to me about getting back in church. And getting my life back together, and I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear that God stuff, because at this point I felt if God really loved me, none of this would have happened to me. Eventually I just gave in and said, yeah, I'm going to go to church, and got in the truck and drove away. But I didn't go to church. I went to sit in the parking lot for 2 hours. That happened about 2 more times, and each time I got closer and closer to going to church. And then one day I finally made it over the 210 bridge, and I was at the point and said, well, if I'm going to go to church, I'm going to go to church. I'm already this far, let me go. So I kind of had to, I guess, get myself in the mood, and I started looking for praise and worship songs to listen to on the way to church. My favorite song is How He Loves. So I searched How He Loves on YouTube, and I'm sitting there in the parking lot of church, and I found it. It was the first one, and I pressed play. When I pressed play, the song didn't start. It was a testimony. John Mark McMillan wrote How He Loves when he was mad at God. Whenever he needed to hear God say, I love you, even though I'm mad at you. And I needed God to say, I love you, even though I was mad at him. Went home, grabbed my Bible, and started reading. And the following Sunday, I finally made it to church. And over time, I started reading my Bible more, and I started praying more again. I started seeking God again. At that point in my life, I realized I had only accepted Jesus as my Savior, not my Lord. I was okay with the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness, but I didn't want Him to shepherd me. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it. I wanted to be in control. After 2 months of going back to church, I'd finally rededicated my life to Christ. And I was serving in church again, and I was happy, and I was where I belonged. I finally felt whole, because I had finally surrendered everything to Christ, not just my baggage. It's really easy to give Christ your junk. It's really hard to give Him the things you cherish, like your relationships and your time and your finances and your abilities. And since then, I've been happier. If I'm not at work or at home with my wife, I'm doing something for church or at church. And I thought my struggle with depression, anxiety, and mental illness was over until about 3 years ago, whenever I lost my best friend to suicide. I was working at Habitat for Humanity, and I was painting at a house in Lake Charles, and I had received a phone call from his wife, and I thought they were calling to make more plans about Thanksgiving that year, because they were going to come. But that's not the conversation we had. She was calling to let me know that my friend had taken his own life. I drove my fist through a wall, and I yelled at God. It was just so confusing. Everything was going right, but I never taken the time to ask my friends how they were, if everything was okay. In the military, because of the high suicide rate, there's a thing called Check Your Battle Buddy, and they're not talking about in a combat zone, they're talking about every day, just asking your friends if they're okay. In theory, it's a good idea, but we're taught to bottle it up and be good Marines and strong soldiers and sailors and airmen. We're too proud or scared to say that we're broken. It's okay to not be okay. There's mornings I still don't want to get out of bed. There's mornings I still don't want to go do things. At 22, I almost became a statistic. 22 veterans a day commit suicide. About 45,000 Americans a year commit suicide, and it's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. You're not alone. There's resources. There's numbers you can call, websites, and counselors, and pastors, and family members, and friends that love you, and whether you know it or not, may know what you're going through and can help you. Check your battle, buddy. Sick.